Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Hargrove called her when she passed him in the hallway at 0300, her scrub still damp from a trauma admission. Just a nurse. He didn't look up from his phone. He never did. Sarah Chen moved through Sacred Heart's ICU with the quiet precision of someone who'd triaged soldiers under mortar fire, though no one here knew that, officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen died in a Black Ops extraction from Ramadi 7 years ago, her record scrubbed after a mission the Pentagon decided never happened. The night shift suited her. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes. Fewer people who might recognize something in the way her hands moved when she worked, something that didn't match the cardigan she wore over her scrubs or the way she kept her voice pitched low and deferential, the way she said, "Of course, doctor, and I apologize, doctor," and never, ever challenged anyone. The combat boots were still in her locker on the third shelf, tucked behind her second stethoscope and a roll of trauma tape she'd stolen from the supply closet 3 months ago because the hospital's tape always tore. She hadn't touched the boots in 2,847 days. She'd counted. Every morning she passed the locker, felt the weight of them there like a question she wasn't ready to answer, and moved on. The boots smelled like diesel exhaust and dust from a place that no longer existed on any map she could find, from a life that had ended so completely and officially that even thinking about it felt like a security violation. But she kept them. She couldn't say why. Muscle memory, maybe. The same muscle memory that made her check a patient's pupils before checking their monitors, or the way her hands had moved this morning during rounds, precise and fluid and wrong for someone who'd never worn anything but scrubs. Sacred Heart occupied 7 stories on South Franklin Street in Denver, a teaching hospital where residents learned to save lives and attending physicians learned to game the insurance system, though only one of them had mastered both with equal competence. Dr. Marcus Hargrove had been there for 11 years, chief of cardiothoracic surgery for the last 4, and in that time he'd built a reputation that moved through the hospital like a pressure system, not always visible, but always felt. His salary was $847,000 a year, not counting the consulting fees from 3 separate pharmaceutical companies, not counting the private practice he ran out of a medical plaza 2 blocks away where he saw patients who could afford to avoid the teaching hospital's bureaucracy entirely. He wore Italian leather shoes that cost more than most residents made in a month. His voice in rounds sounded like authority, like someone who'd never been questioned and had no reason to expect to start. He noticed Sarah Chen on a Tuesday night at 02 for 7 hours when the ICU hummed with that particular quality of darkness that comes right before dawn, when the staff moved slower and the monitors seemed louder and the fluorescent lights cast everything in that shade of white that made human skin look like something already dead. Hargrove was conducting a chart review, something he did maybe twice a month, usually when billing audits from the insurance company started asking uncomfortable questions. He moved through the electronic records system with the casual confidence of someone who'd never once worried about being wrong, pulling up patient files, cross-referencing procedures with diagnoses, and that's when he saw it. A complex aortic valve replacement bill to a patient named Douglas Fitzgerald, a 67-year-old admitted with suspected valve stenosis. The procedure code was worth $340,000 in surgical fees. Hargrove pulled up the operative note. 2 lines. Diagnostic cardiac catheterization only. No replacement. No valve work. Just a tube inserted into the femoral artery, a quick look at the coronary anatomy, and the patient sent to recovery. He was about to close the file when he noticed Sarah standing 3 feet away, pretending to check a 4-pump that didn't need checking, her eyes visible above the blue surgical mask, and her gaze was locked on his screen. Not looking away. Not pretending she hadn't seen. Just looking. Hargrove felt something shift in his chest, that particular sensation that came right before anger, the kind of anger that came from being observed. He closed the file without a word. By morning, he decided she was a liability. By noon, he'd started making phone calls. Sarah Chen existed in those quiet corners of Sacred Heart's ICU that most people never noticed, the spaces between monitors where the real work happened. She'd been hired 6 months ago with references that checked out perfectly, pristine work history, excellent evaluations, no gaps, nothing unusual, because the references were carefully crafted by a man at the Pentagon who had a lot of practice making inconvenient records disappear. She volunteered for the unpopular shifts. She never called in sick. She never asked for time off. She never complained about double shifts or understaffing or the way the newer residents treated the nursing staff like furniture. She just showed up, did the work, and disappeared again when her shift ended. On her second week, she'd saved a patient's life by recognizing the early signs of septic shock before the attending physician did, but she presented it so carefully, so deferentially. "I'm sorry to bother you, doctor, but I'm wondering if we should check lactate levels," perhaps, that the physician took credit for the observation and nobody remembered that Sarah had been the one who noticed the pattern first. Her hands told a different story than the rest of her, if anyone had been paying attention. They moved with the economical precision of someone who'd done critical procedures under conditions that didn't allow for hesitation or second-guessing. When she replaced an 4-line, she did it in 12 seconds flat, the needle in on the first try, tape secure, flow running. When she positioned a patient on the hospital bed, she moved with the careful attention to detail that came from understanding that a pressure sore could mean sepsis, could mean death, and that the margin between competent care and disaster was sometimes just a few millimeters of attention. There was a thin scar running along her left forearm, barely visible under the fluorescent lights unless you knew to look for it, pale white against skin that had once been darker before she'd stopped spending time in the sun. The scar was exactly 3 inches long and ran parallel to the radius bone, the kind of scar that came from a field surgical repair done with someone's hands shaking slightly, probably because the person being sutured up was someone you'd held under fire 12 minutes earlier. The emergency bowel resection came in on a Thursday night when Sarah had already been working for 14 hours, covering for another nurse who'd called in with a migraine. The patient was a 52-year-old male with a perforation in his sigmoid colon, sepsis already beginning its march through his bloodstream, and the surgeon on call was Dr. Hargrove himself. Sarah prepped the OR with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd done this before, laying out instruments, checking the anesthesia cart, running through the safety checklist even though she was supposed to just be an observer. The attending nurses were the ones responsible for setup, but the attending nurses at Sacred Heart were young and still learning, and Sarah stood back and watched them make small mistakes, clamps in the wrong spot on the instrument tray, suction tips not fully secured, and she didn't correct them, just made mental notes and adjusted things slightly when nobody was looking. Hargrove strode in at 2,213 hours, already suited up, his hands held in front of him in that characteristic surgeon pose, fingers splayed to avoid contaminating the sterile field. He didn't acknowledge Sarah's presence. He never did anymore. She'd caught him 3 more times in the past 72 hours reviewing charts that didn't match procedures, billing codes for valve replacements on patients who'd only had diagnostic catheterizations, spinal fusion surgeries that had never happened, complex oncology procedures that appeared on the charts of patients with routine orthopedic complaints. Once you started looking, the pattern was impossible to miss. It was the same technique she'd seen used by officers in Ramadi, taking more resources than they needed, inflating numbers to justify budgets, skimming from supply requisitions. The corruption of someone comfortable enough in their position that they stopped worrying about consequences. The surgery took 47 minutes. Hargrove worked with the technical competence you'd expect from someone with his credentials, his movements efficient and practiced. But Sarah noticed something else as she watched from the corner of the OR, noticed the way he cut corners, resected more tissue than strictly necessary, extended the procedure to justify calling it complex when the pathology was straightforward. Every minute of surgery he added was another $1 in his favor, another entry on a chart that would justify his consulting fees, another small theft that had become such a habit he probably didn't even notice it anymore. Her eyes tracked his hands as he worked, and her hands stayed absolutely still at her sides, her voice professional and deferential when he requested instruments, Bovie cable, doctor, and suction please, doctor, words that felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth, someone smaller, someone who didn't matter. But there was another witness in the room that night. Adjacent to the main OR was a smaller operating bay where another surgeon was prepping a cardiac case, a 4-star general named Marcus McKnight, the architect of the Ramadi offensive and the only man who knew where 7 of Sarah's closest friends had buried their equipment before extraction. McKnight's surgery had been scheduled for the following day, but his EKG had changed that morning, a subtle shift in the ST segments that suggested an infarction brewing, and his cardiologist had decided he couldn't wait. So McKnight was there, already draped and prepped, waiting for Hargrove to finish the bowel resection before starting the cardiac work. From the observation window in the adjacent bay, if you positioned yourself correctly, if you knew where to stand and how to angle your head, you could see directly into the main OR. You could see the surgical team. You could see the hands of everyone involved. The observation window was reinforced glass, double-paned and expensive, designed to minimize glare so residents could study technique without contaminating the sterile field. General McKnight stood at that window for the final 17 minutes of the bowel resection, his body still elevated slightly to accommodate the cardiac monitoring equipment, his eyes fixed on Sarah's hands. She was stabilizing tissue, assisting with retraction, doing the 1,000 small things that an observer might not notice. But McKnight noticed. He noticed the way she anticipated Hargrove's movements, the way she positioned instruments before he asked for them, the way she handled the electrocautery unit with one hand while maintaining perfect visualization with the other. He noticed the modified suture pattern she used when tying off a bleeder on the peritoneal membrane, a pattern that wasn't standard hospital technique, a pattern that was taught only to SEAL medics in the field because it held better under conditions where proper follow-up care might not be available for 72 hours. The general's eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened. His hand came up to his chest where his dog tags lay beneath the surgical drape, a small gesture that probably meant something to him, probably meant he was remembering something, someone. The cardiac nurse noticed his vital signs spike on the monitor, heart rate jumping from 68 to 87, blood pressure climbing slightly. She asked if he was in pain. He said no. He kept watching Sarah's hands move through the surgical field with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, somewhere else, under circumstances that no one in this hospital would ever need to know about. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular sound that only surgical suites made, and in that hum, in that moment, the general understood something that the rest of Sacred Heart staff had completely missed. The campaign started in the physician's lounge on Tuesday morning, Hargrove's voice carrying through the open door as Sarah passed with medication trays balanced on her forearms. "I'll bet anyone here $500 the little mouse quits before Friday." Laughter rippled through the room like ripples in still water, and she kept walking, one measured breath, her hand steady as porcelain. The tray didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She was good at being invisible. By Thursday, the entire Sacred Heart Day shift had heard the wager. Hargrove had amplified it, mentioned it to residents, to nurses at the station, to anyone within earshot of his condescension. Sarah moved through the hospital the way she'd moved through Ramadi, present but unremarkable, doing the work that kept people alive while the ones with rank took the credit. She didn't expect recognition. She didn't expect fairness. She expected exactly this. The cafeteria was crowded at 12:16 p.m. when Hargrove walked directly into her path. His shoulder caught her tray from the side, not quite accidental, deliberate as a knife cut. Soup splashed across the white tile in an arc, the crash of plastic echoing through the seating area like a gunshot in a canyon. Everyone turned. Exactly the audience he'd wanted. "Clumsy," he said, his voice polished with contempt. "Maybe nursing isn't your calling, sweetheart." Sarah knelt to gather the scattered containers. The tile was cold beneath her knees. She'd kneeled in worse places, behind a burning Humvee in the summer heat of Anbar province, her hand shaking as she applied a tourniquet to a corpsman's femoral artery, knowing they had maybe 4 minutes before the bleeding became irreversible. This was nothing. This was a cafeteria with fluorescent lights and strangers watching. She wiped the single tear from her cheek without breaking eye contact with him. Her voice came out steady as a rifle scope. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor." She stood, tray fragments in her hands, and walked toward the trash bin without waiting for his response. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it changed the temperature of the air. Hargrove followed her, his face flushed now with the kind of rage that comes from not getting the reaction he'd engineered. He wanted her to crumble. He wanted witnesses to her breaking. Instead, he'd gotten composure. He'd gotten steel wrapped in scrubs. By Friday afternoon, he'd escalated. The setting was different but the intent was identical: maximum humiliation, maximum witnesses. He threw a patient chart at her feet in front of 6 residents and 4 attending physicians outside the ICU. The chart hit the tile with a slap that echoed like a bell. His voice was loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "Pick that up, sweetheart." That's what nurses do, they pick things up for doctors. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that made the ventilators sound like they were breathing too hard. Sarah took one measured breath, feeling the tear track down her cheek before she could stop it. She didn't wipe it away this time. Instead, she maintained perfect eye contact with Hargrove while her voice dropped to something that wasn't quite a whisper but carried further than shouting ever could. "I've picked up pieces of men better than you'll ever be, Doctor." She bent, retrieved the chart with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this before under circumstances no one here would ever understand, and walked away as Hargrove's face flushed the color of a warning light. The residents exchanged glances. The attending physicians exchanged glances. Nobody moved until Sarah disappeared around the corner toward the medication room. Then the whispers started, but they weren't the kind Hargrove had anticipated. By 6:15 p.m. that Friday evening, Hargrove was in his office with the door locked and his phone at his ear. He'd spent the afternoon assembling ammunition, the way a skilled surgeon assembled instruments, each piece precise, each placement strategic. He wasn't going to bully her out anymore. Bullying hadn't worked. She had something he didn't understand yet, some kind of internal architecture that wouldn't crack under pressure. But everything cracked under investigation. Everything shattered when you pulled the right threads. First call, board member Harrison Hayes, who owed Hargrove 3 favors from a medical liability case last year. "I'm concerned about a staff member's credentials, Harrison. Deeply concerned. Might need an external review before she hurt someone." The words were carefully chosen, designed to trigger institutional alarm rather than outright accusation. Accusations could be defended against. Vague concerns about patient safety required immediate action. Second call, the fabricated references from Sarah's personnel file. 2 clinical supervisors from a Navy medical facility that Hargrove had researched thoroughly enough to know the right names, the right departments. He asked pointed questions with false certainty in his voice, the kind of certainty that made people believe they'd already confirmed the information. "Yes, I understand she worked under your supervision from 2018 to 2020. I'm just trying to verify her advanced suturing certifications. The needle decompression protocols especially. Can you confirm those?" The way he phrased it, with the expectation built in that yes, of course they would confirm it, meant that any hesitation would sound like doubt. Third call, at 7:42 p.m., to a private investigator named Caldwell who'd helped with other matters that needed to stay discreet. "I need someone to examine credentials. Employment history. Educational background. Medical licenses. Whatever you can find. I need it by Monday, and it needs to be thorough enough to stand up in a hearing if necessary." $500 wired that evening, with another $500 upon completion. What Hargrove didn't realize as he hung up that third phone call was that he'd just committed himself to a path that had no exit. He'd stopped being the man who made crude jokes in the lounge and started being the man who weaponized institutions against someone who'd survived things he couldn't imagine. He'd crossed from social cruelty into strategic sabotage, and once you crossed that line, you had to keep walking forward because the only thing behind you was the understanding that you'd chosen this. Sarah didn't know about the calls yet. She was in the medication room, hand steady as she counted out pharmaceuticals for the night shift. Dexamethasone. Fentanyl. Lorazepam. The doses were precise, 3 milligrams, 50 micrograms, 2 milligrams, exact as the measurements in her rifle scope back when measuring things meant the difference between a clean shot and a miss. Her hands remembered the precision even if her mind tried to forget the context. The tear that had tracked down her cheek in the cafeteria and again in the ICU, that was something she'd need to process. She hadn't let tears come during actual combat. She'd let them come exactly twice in 18 years, once when she'd picked up pieces of Corpsman 3rd Class Riley Matthews from a road outside Fallujah, and once when she'd learned that 3 of her original 8-person team weren't coming home. The tear wasn't fear. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was something else, the recognition that she'd been seen, truly seen, by someone with the authority to destroy her cover if he decided to look hard enough. By the time the night shift started at 11 p.m., Hargrove's investigator was already pulling records. By Saturday morning, those records would begin to show inconsistencies that didn't quite make sense unless you understood the special clearance levels that didn't appear in civilian databases. Her employment history would have gaps that looked like suspicious fraud unless you knew that those gaps were classified operations that could be neither confirmed nor denied. But Sarah didn't know that yet. She was working the ICU with the kind of focused calm that came from compartmentalizing each patient a problem to solve, each task a small point of control in a world that had already proven itself unpredictable. She restocked 4 poles. She monitored oxygen saturation. She moved like someone who'd learned that survival often meant being too useful to discard. And then, at 3:17 a.m. on Saturday, the announcement came through the intercom, controlled but urgent, the kind of tone that meant something was arriving that mattered. Incoming transport, ETA for minutes. 4-star military patient, cardiac emergency. Director pre-op security detail accompanying. The nurses around her exchanged glances. 4-star generals didn't come to Sacred Heart. 4-star generals went to military medical centers with full security clearances and classified protocols. Sarah's hands paused for exactly 1 second. Long enough for her to recognize the number and understand what it meant. Long enough to know that whatever Hargrove had set in motion was about to intersect with something far larger than his professional vendetta. The machinery she'd tried to leave behind in Ramadi was arriving at Sacred Heart in approximately 4 minutes, and she had no control over what happened next. She resumed her work, her voice steady as always. "I'm going on break." General McKnight's convoy rolled up to Sacred Heart's emergency bay at 18:47 hours, 3 black Suburbans with tinted windows and 2 uniformed security personnel in dress blues moving with the kind of synchronized precision that came from decades of classified operations. The ER staff had been briefed, cardiac arrhythmia, scheduled for surgical intervention, VIP protocol. Nobody asked questions when a 4-star Special Forces commander came through the doors. The kind of man whose operational history was compartmentalized so far above top secret that even hospital administrators knew better than to search for details. He moved like someone who'd navigated every kind of terrain except the one his own heart was failing in now, steady, controlled, but there was something in the way his security detail kept their hands visible that told Sarah everything she needed to know about the gravity of his condition. She watched from the ICU corridor as orderlies prepped him for transport to the surgical bay, his jaw set with the same kind of composure she recognized from her own training, from the mirror on the worst mornings when her hand still remembered Ramadi. The surgical team assembled in the OR like a gathering of eagles, 12 doctors total, the entire on-call surgical staff that Sacred Heart could muster. 2 cardiac surgeons, for surgical residents, a perfusionist, 2 anesthesiologists, a surgical nurse first assistant, and an operating room nurse who'd logged more hours than most people logged years. Dr. Marcus Sterling, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, stood at the primary table reviewing the general's imaging on the monitor. Hargrove positioned himself at the secondary station, already running through pre-op checklist with the cold precision of someone who'd built his reputation on flawless execution. The general was prepped in the adjacent surgical bay, the observable one, where junior residents could watch through the glass partition and learn from the masters. Sarah had been assigned to the observation room to monitor vitals and assist with documentation. She stood behind the glass with a tablet, watching the monitors, watching the attending surgeons move around the table with practiced efficiency. The fluorescent surgical lights hummed their monotonous frequency above the operative field. The anesthesiologist called out, "All lines in. Starting induction." The general's eyes closed. The machine took over, ventilator, monitors, central line, arterial line, everything tracking the boundaries between life and managed unconsciousness. The surgery began at 19:23 hours. Routine. By the book. The kind of cardiac bypass that these surgeons had performed hundreds of times. Sarah watched the monitors climb and settle, oxygen saturation holding steady at 99%, blood pressure maintained with pressors, heart rate stable at 78 beats per minute under anesthesia. The surgical team moved like an orchestra, each member knowing exactly when to anticipate the next movement. Instruments changed hands. Suction cleared the field. The perfusionist monitored the bypass machine with the kind of attention a pilot reserves for instrument panels in a thunderstorm. 90 minutes into the procedure, everything was exactly where it should be. The sternum was open. The pericardium was exposed. The surgical team was preparing for bypass cannulation when the first alarm sounded, not a crisis alarm, not yet, but something the anesthesiologist noted, some irregularity in the rhythm that made him glance at the monitor and adjust medications. Sarah's hand tightened on the tablet. She'd heard that tone before. It was the sound of something about to break. The arrhythmia worsened at 0156 hours. The monitor showed runs of ventricular tachycardia. Then it flatlined. The surgical team didn't panic. Panic was a luxury of untrained people, but they moved faster. "He's in VFib," the anesthesiologist called out. "Starting compressions." The senior cardiac surgeon took over chest compressions, the surgical team reversing roles instantly, the perfusionist increasing flow on the bypass machine as if they could pump the heart back to life through sheer mechanical will. Defibrillation paddles. Clear. The body arched with electrical current. The monitor showed nothing. They shocked him again. Again. The surgical team continued compressions in rotating shifts, different pairs taking over every 2 minutes to prevent fatigue, to keep the compressions effective, the depth exactly right, the rhythm steady. Blood products were pushed. Medication cycled through, epinephrine, amiodarone, calcium chloride, sodium bicarbonate. Everything was protocol. Everything was textbook. Nothing was working. Sarah watched from behind the glass, her breathing controlled, her expression neutral, while her mind was already 3 steps ahead of the room. She saw the monitors. She saw the numbers. 40 minutes of resuscitation. She saw what they all saw, the cardiac output falling despite everything, the peripheral perfusion dying, the core temperature dropping because they'd opened him up and exposed his chest cavity to the cold surgical lights and the air conditioning, and time was moving in the direction it always moved, away from living and toward something else. At 0237 hours, after 40 minutes of continuous resuscitation, Dr. Sterling stepped back from the operative field. His gloves were soaked with the general's blood. His face was blank. "I think we need to call it," he said. The surgical team looked at each other across the operative field, 12 doctors, 12 people who'd each taken an oath to do no harm and now faced the specific failure of being unable to do anything at all. Hargrove pulled off his surgical gloves with a sharp, deliberate gesture. "Time of death," he said, his voice cutting through the OR like something with edges. 0241 hours. He looked directly at the observation window. At Sarah. Their eyes locked for exactly 2 seconds. Then Hargrove's gaze shifted, deliberately, to the tracheal tube still inserted in the general's airway. Then back to Sarah. He knew. He was showing her that he knew. She was watching the monitors from the observation room, and he was showing her that he'd already begun the process of documentation, the paperwork that would lock this death in place, that would move the general from patient to body, from active resuscitation to post-mortem protocol. One by one, the surgical team stripped off their gloves and stepped back from the table. The scrub nurse began documenting the end of resuscitation routine. The anesthesiologist called for the ventilator to be discontinued. The monitors showed what Sarah already knew, a flat line across all cardiac leads, no respiratory effort, nothing but the electrical hum of machines that were no longer connected to anything living. Hargrove moved to the door of the surgical bay. Before he stepped out, he paused at the window where Sarah stood. He raised one hand and made a deliberate gesture, a wave, almost mocking, before he turned and walked toward the hallway. Sarah stood frozen behind the glass. Her hands felt like they were moving in slow motion as they gripped the tablet. The observation room was empty except for her. She could hear Hargrove's voice in the hallway, already on his phone, already talking in that measured, professional tone. Yes, the 4-star. Didn't make it. Pause. Full resuscitation, 40 minutes, complete team effort. Nothing to be done. She could hear the lie in his voice, not about the resuscitation, but about what came next. Hargrove appeared at the observation window from inside the OR. He motioned for the resident standing guard at the OR doors, a third-year resident named Patterson, competent but junior, the kind of resident who still believed that hierarchy meant something. Hargrove spoke quietly, but Sarah could read his lips from behind the glass. No one enters. Body stays on the table. I'm calling medical examiner protocol. Get me verbal confirmation from the charge nurse before anyone moves him. Paperwork first. Then transport. Patterson nodded, his face serious, his posture stiffening as if he'd just been given the kind of responsibility that came with real consequences. Hargrove's phone was already out. Sarah watched him type something into the Notes app, his thumbs moving with the deliberate speed of someone composing a message that would matter. The board chairman's name was visible for exactly 1 second before the phone went dark. Sarah's eyes moved back to the operative field. The general lay still on the surgical table. His sternum was still open. His chest cavity was still exposed to the lights. The monitors were still running, but they weren't measuring anything anymore. She could see the deviation in his airway, subtle, but there. She could see the swelling in his neck. She could see the tracheal deviation that happened when pressure built up inside the chest cavity, when air leaked into the space between the lung and the pleura, when the lung collapsed on itself while everyone was focused on the heart. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pushing on the superior vena cava, restricting blood return, dropping cardiac output, stopping the heart. The kind of thing that should have been caught during the initial chest opening. The kind of thing that would have been caught if someone had spent less time playing politics and more time listening to what the surgical team was already telling him. The kind of thing that took 90 seconds to fix once you knew it was there. She had 3 minutes before brain damage became irreversible. She knew this the way she knew how to field dress a wound in a moving vehicle. The way she knew how to position her body to shield an injured Marine from shrapnel. The way she knew the exact angle and depth for needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She'd done it in the back of a Humvee with nothing but a 14-gauge catheter needle and the rotor wash of medevac helicopters in the distance. She'd done it in a forward operating base with a casualty's blood running over her hands and 5 rounds of incoming fire per minute. She'd done it for 6 different men in Ramadi, and 5 of them were still breathing because she'd refused to accept the diagnosis that everyone else had already signed off on. Patterson was standing at the OR doors, his face set in the kind of determined expression that came with following orders. The observation room felt like it was shrinking. The monitor screen showing the general's flatlined cardiac rhythm seemed very far away. Sarah's hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind was running through the physics of what happened next, the timing of getting to the OR, the barrier of the locked doors, the specifics of which needle she still had access to, whether her hand tremor would matter or whether her hand wouldn't tremble at all because her hand never trembled when the stakes were highest. She could see her reflection in the observation window glass. Behind the reflection was the general's still form on the surgical table. Behind that was Dr. Hargrove, walking back down the hallway, his phone already to his ear, already shaping the narrative, already locking the death in place. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless frequency above the operative field. Sarah shouldered past the resident with enough force to send him stumbling backward into a crash cart. "Move or I'll move you." Her voice came out flat, stripped of the deference she'd worn like a second skin for 4 years. The resident froze. Nobody disobeyed in Sacred Heart's trauma wing. Nobody except someone who'd already calculated the exact force required to move a 190-pound man without breaking anything. She burst through the OR doors just as Hargrove's voice crackled through the intercom. "Security to OR 03, immediately." His words carried the confidence of a man who'd never once been told no by someone beneath his station. She ignored him, moving toward the draped body on the table with the precision of someone who'd performed this procedure in the back of a shuddering Humvee, in the dark, with incoming fire painting the sky orange. The general lay motionless, 12 attending physicians having declared him beyond salvage 40 minutes ago. 12. The number hung in the fluorescent light like a judgment. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his face flushed crimson. "Step away from that patient." His voice pitched higher with each syllable. "You're done. You're finished. You just performed an unauthorized procedure on a deceased patient. Security is en route." She didn't acknowledge him. Her hands moved toward the crash cart, muscle memory from Ramadi taking over, the same instinct that had kept men breathing when the dust cleared and the screaming stopped. 14-gauge needle in her right hand. The needle felt like an extension of her skeleton, like something she'd been born holding. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingers found the landmarks on the general's chest like she'd rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times, which she had, just never with a 4-star general bleeding out beneath her hands while a hospital administrator screamed at her. The needle penetrated skin, muscle, the visceral resistance of living tissue, and then the hiss. That specific exhalation of released air under pressure, the sound of a pneumothorax escaping back into the atmosphere where it belonged. The sound of a man who'd been dead coming back. 15 seconds passed. The monitor remained flatlined. The residents froze in the hallway, watching through the observation window, waiting for security to arrive and remove her. Hargrove's mouth moved but no sound came out, rage and confusion warring across his face. Then the general's chest heaved. 1 breath. 2. His body remembered how to survive before his brain caught up. The monitor shrieked as it picked up a rhythm, erratic at first, then strengthening, the green line sketching a heartbeat back into existence. Sarah started compressions without being asked, her hands locking over his sternum with the practiced geometry of 4 years as a trauma nurse and 12 years before that as a field medic. Her voice dropped another octave as she called out orders, not requests. Epinephrine. 1 milligram. Now. The attending nurse who declared him dead moved automatically, muscle memory overriding her shock. Bag him. Someone check the chest tube placement. 2 residents scrambled to comply. The general's color began to shift from the mottled purple of death to the angry red of oxygenation. Within 90 seconds, a blood pressure registered. Within 2 minutes, spontaneous respirations. His eyes began moving beneath closed lids. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his face draining of all color as if someone had turned a valve and let the rage pour out, leaving only white shock behind. His jaw worked silently. Sarah looked at him once, just once, while still maintaining chest compressions. The look wasn't defiance. It was something colder, the look of someone who'd already decided his consequences and accepted them. But that wasn't the worst part for Hargrove. The worst part came when he saw the general's eyes open, saw them track to Sarah, saw recognition flare across features that had been legally dead 3 minutes earlier. Saw him mouth something, a call sign, maybe, or a name, that made Sarah's hands pause for exactly 1 second before resuming compressions. Hargrove's phone was in his hand before security even reached the OR doors. His voice on the line was different now, harder, more precise, the voice of a man who'd just realized he'd made an enemy of something he couldn't understand. "We need to activate Protocol 7. Yes. Now. Before she leaves the building." By 0800 hours, Sarah sat in a metal chair across from a woman in HR whose nameplate read Patricia Slauson, RN, Director of Human Resources. The woman looked uncomfortable in the way of people who'd been given orders from above and hated following them. "Your suspension is effective immediately, pending investigation into the unauthorized procedure performed on a deceased patient." Hargrove's documentation was already in the file. 12 attending physicians on record. Code time 0241. Time of death 0241. Your actions were outside the scope of nursing practice. The hospital's legal team recommends we preserve evidence of violation. Sarah's badge lay on the desk between them, disconnected from her neck for the first time in 4 years. The lanyard coiled beside it like a severed thing. She didn't speak. What was there to say? She'd known this was coming. She'd felt it the moment Hargrove's face went white and he understood what had just happened. She'd understood that saving a 4-star general, a man connected to classified operations, a man who knew classified assets, a man whose death would trigger investigations she couldn't survive, she'd understood that by saving him, she'd just painted a target on her back so visible that even a bureaucrat from HR could see it. Hargrove had been calling people since 0300. She knew this because Patricia kept glancing at her computer, reading new emails as they arrived. By dawn, he'd contacted 3 board members. Called them personally. The language in the emails was careful, concerned about the integrity of our credentialing process. I've had a private investigator look into her background. There are significant discrepancies in her employment history. We should consider whether she was ever qualified for this position. The investigator had already found what Hargrove had told him to find. The references were fabricated. The nursing license had been obtained through a program that technically existed but whose records had been scrubbed from every official database 3 weeks after her separation from active duty. The social security number was real, courtesy of the Pentagon and a new identity protocol designed by people who built new people the way other people built bookshelves. By 0930, she'd signed papers acknowledging that her suspension carried no prejudice against her future employment, but her employment was over. The distinction felt like philosophy. She'd packed her locker herself while a hospital security guard, a man named Daniel who'd always nodded politely in the break room, watched from 6 feet away with the expression of someone deeply sorry about something completely beyond his control. The cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" went in the box. The dying succulent with brown leaves curled at the edges. A stethoscope she'd owned since her first month as a civilian, back when she thought she might actually pull this off. A photo from Ramadi in 2019, taken 2 days before the extraction that was supposed to be her last day alive. 8 faces in that photo. Her arm around a Marine named Tommy Vasquez. Only 3 of the 8 were still alive. Tommy wasn't one of them. By sunset, she sat at a bus stop on 7th Avenue, cardboard box on her lap, rain hammering the plastic shelter so hard that she could feel the vibration through the metal bench. She was getting soaked. Her scrubs, her last shift scrubs, because she'd walked out still wearing them, clung to her ribs like a second skin. The rain smelled like distant ozone and hot asphalt cooling in the evening chill. Denver's August weather, unpredictable as artillery. Around her, the city went about its business. People walked past with phones to their ears. A transit bus hissed to a stop, passengers boarding and exiting in the careful dance of strangers sharing space. Nobody looked at her. That was something, at least. At the bottom of the cardboard box, beneath the mug and the photo and the other artifacts of her borrowed life, were the boots. Combat boots, scuffed tan leather, the stitching on the right one reinforced where she'd had them patched 3 years into her first tour. The laces were still knotted from the last time she'd worn them, before the extraction, before Ramadi became a thing that happened to someone else, someone she used to be. She'd packed them the day she became Sarah Chen. She'd told herself she'd never wear them again. The war was over. She was a nurse now. She was healing, not fighting. The rain drummed against the shelter's plastic roof like mortar fire on a roof made of different things. She didn't move. She sat very still, the box on her lap, her hands gripping its edges, watching the traffic lights cycle through their colors. Green to yellow to red to green again. The mechanical patience of infrastructure. The rain fell harder. And then her phone buzzed. She didn't remember taking it out of her pocket, but it was in her hand. Unknown number. Denver area code, but the next 3 digits were military routing. The message was text, not voice, Angel 6. Confirm you're secure. Aurora protocol activated. We're coming. 6 actual. She'd been declared dead for years ago. Officially dead, completely dead, all the way to the death certificate signed by a Pentagon officer whose name she'd never known. She'd been built into a new person with fabricated history and scrubbed records, told to stay invisible, told to heal people who would never know what she was, told to live a life that required constant forgetting. But the general had seen. In that moment when his eyes opened and he recognized the field suture pattern she'd learned from the SEAL combat medics who'd trained her, when he recognized the way she moved, the precision of her hands, the authority in her voice when every nurse on that team was supposed to be deferring to the doctors, in that moment, the cover had cracked. Someone had called someone else. And now someone was coming. The rain fell on the cardboard box, and the worn combat boots inside it waited in the dark, patient as weapons that haven't fired in years but remember exactly how. The Black Hawk descended through Denver's pre-dawn darkness like a predator settling onto its kill, rotor wash hammering the emergency helipad with a sound that woke every floor in Sacred Heart's North Tower. The landing was unauthorized. No clearance from ATC. No hospital notification. Just the percussion of military authority arriving without permission and expecting compliance anyway. Sarah stood at the fourth-floor window watching the aircraft touch down, her cardboard box still on the bench beside her, rain pooling around the worn boots inside. The phone in her pocket, the classified Pentagon line she'd sworn never to use again, had buzzed exactly once at 05 for 7 hours. A single text, Aurora protocol activated. Retrieve imminent. 2 Navy SEAL team operators descended the Black Hawk's rear ramp in dress uniforms that looked like they'd been tailored by people who understood that precision was respect. The uniforms were not for ceremony. They were for intimidation. The lead operator, Command Master Chief James O'Breaker Halloway, moved through Sacred Heart's corridors with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst humanity could construct. His partner, a younger lieutenant commander named Clayton, carried a locked hard drive case against his chest like a detonation device. Because in a way, it was. The boardroom door opened at 0601 hours. Hargrove was mid-sentence, gesturing at a presentation slide showing clinical competency questions regarding RN Sarah Chen, credentialing review. The board members looked up. The CEO's expression shifted when she registered the dress uniforms. Nobody walked into her hospital in navy dress blues unless the order had already been given. Breaker stepped forward. His voice had the texture of gravel under a tank tread, each word placed with surgical precision. We're here for Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. The woman who saved General McKnight 12 hours ago. He paused, letting that settle. The architect of the Ramadi offensive. The only man who knows where 12 assets are buried in the Afghan mountains. The general who just walked out of your ICU because a decorated combat medic didn't stop working when 12 doctors told her to stop. Hargrove's face had the quality of cooling wax. His mouth opened. Nothing emerged. Clayton opened the hard drive case. Marcus Webb, Sacred Heart's IT director, a former Marine from the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, stepped forward with the practiced composure of someone who'd already briefed the generals in this room and found them wanting. He plugged the drive into the boardroom's wall display with a click that sounded louder than it should have. The first file was a deletion log from Sacred Heart security servers. Timestamps. Access records. Dr. Hargrove accessed the restricted ICU security system at 0300 this morning, Webb said, his voice carrying no inflection, just facts arranged like artillery pieces. Deleted 16 hours of footage. From the ICU. From OART 3. From the corridors. He used his administrator credentials to erase evidence of his actions. The CEO's hands were white-knuckled on the table. Former Marine, Breaker said quietly. We maintain redundant backups. Trust but verify. He nodded at Webb. The footage played. The first clip was from the billing department, timestamp 0900 hours 3 weeks prior. Hargrove's hands visible on a keyboard, patient chart numbers changing in real time, a complex spinal reconstruction procedure, billed at $847,000, disappearing from one patient's file and transferring to another patient who'd received basic wound closure. 5 more files changed in rapid succession. Medical device company logos flashed across the screen. Invoice amounts. Kickback codes. Then the cafeteria footage. Hargrove's hand striking Sarah's tray. The deliberate arc of it. The chart flying at her feet. His mouth moving, pick that up, sweetheart, and her response audible despite the cafeteria noise, steady as a held rifle. "I've picked up pieces of men better than you'll ever be, Doctor." The room was the kind of quiet where fluorescent electricity buzzes become audible, where breath sounds like an intrusion. The next clip was from OR 3:0140 hours. Sarah preparing to assist in what should have been routine cardiac surgery. Hargrove visible in the video, gesturing to a resident, his lips reading clearly, "Keep her out of the room when the general crashes. I want a clean preemptive suspension before she becomes a variable." The timestamp changed to 0200 hours. The general coded. Monitors flatlined. The first crash cart arrived at 0201. Sarah was visible in the observation window, watching. Hargrove was visible saying something to another resident, blocking the corridor, his hand up in a palm-out gesture that said no. The next 17 minutes played in compressed time, surgical team working, exhaustion setting in, the telemetry line going flat at 0217 hours, Hargrove's lips forming time of death, 0241 hours, his text to the board chairman visible on a split screen, timestamped 0238, McKnight didn't make it. Chen was on shift. Recommend immediate disciplinary review of her credentials to disassociate us from any allegations. Sarah was in the general's ICU room when he gasped back into life. The timestamp read 0242 hours. 1 minute after Hargrove had declared him dead. The CEO's voice was ice-breaking on a frozen lake. "You tried to prevent her from saving him." Webb inserted a second drive. Financial records cascaded across the display, fraudulent billing stretching back 8 months, $2.3 million in insurance fraud, kickback agreements with 3 medical device companies, offshore accounts holding deposits that corresponded exactly to procedures Hargrove had ordered unnecessarily, aggressive ones, painful ones, procedures that had no clinical justification except that they were profitable. He knew she noticed the discrepancies, Webb said. His scarred hands were steady against the table. She flagged 14 billing codes as unusual. Asked for a peer review. Hargrove needed her gone before she escalated to compliance. So he escalated first. Made her a credibility problem. Harassment, then systematic character destruction, then the fabricated investigator report. Webb's voice carried something that sounded like controlled contempt. He was 5 days away from her reporting to the state board. Then the general crashed. She saved him. So Hargrove tried to prevent her from saving him. Then he tried to destroy the evidence that he'd tried to prevent her from saving him. Breaker leaned forward. His presence had shifted, no longer a messenger, now something more dangerous. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen holds the Navy Cross for pulling 6 men through a minefield under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. She was declared KIA to protect an operation this hospital's head of surgery is currently too stupid to deserve an explanation about. She saved more lives in Ramadi alone than this man has seen in 23 years of practice. And he spent 3 months trying to destroy her because she noticed he was stealing money. Hargrove's voice cracked. This is a misunderstanding. The billing codes were clinically justified. I can explain the procedures. The device companies are standard partners. I was simply trying to ensure quality review of an employee whose background seemed. Whose background seemed what? Breaker didn't raise his voice. The quieter he became, the more dangerous the silence grew. Whose background seemed threatening? Whose hands seemed too competent? Whose decision to save a 4-star general seemed like an inconvenience to your fraud scheme? Hospital security entered without being called, as if they'd been waiting in the hallway for permission. Hargrove's medical license was suspended by the Colorado Board of Nursing by 1400 hours that same day. Revoked by Friday. His malpractice insurance dropped him before lunch. 3 hospitals rejected his applications within a week, their HR directors citing character and fitness concerns in language that meant his name was now radioactive to every credentialing committee from Denver to the Front Range. The last anyone saw of Dr. Marcus Hargrove was 6 months later, a Tuesday afternoon in October, working a folding table outside a strip mall on Colfax Avenue. He was selling supplemental insurance policies to people who couldn't afford the real thing, his shirt collar wrinkled, his hands shaking slightly as he filled out forms. When a woman in scrubs walked past, just a routine pedestrian, probably not even from Sacred Heart, he flinched as if she were carrying a weapon. Sarah stood in the general's ICU room at 1800 hours that evening, wearing her old uniform for the first time in 4 years, the dress blues with the Navy Cross on her chest, the ribbon stripe above her name tape, the sleeve insignia of a senior chief whose combat record was no longer classified because General McKnight had declassified it in person, in the boardroom, in front of hospital leadership and federal investigators. The metal caught the warm light from the western windows. Denver spread out beyond the glass like a city that didn't yet understand it had just lost one of its predators and gained something far more dangerous, a doctor who was actually a warrior. McKnight was awake. His eyes tracked hers with the clarity of a man whose heart had been broken and repaired by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. His monitors showed strong vitals, sinus rhythm, blood pressure 118/72, oxygen saturation 98% on room air, heart rate 64 and steady as a metronome that had learned precision through 12 years of combat operations. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was quieter than his rank suggested, which meant he was probably even more dangerous than his reputation indicated. "Twice. Once in Ramadi when you pulled intelligence that got my team out of an ambush. Once last night when 12 doctors declared me dead and you didn't believe them." Sarah's response carried no hesitation, no false modesty, no performative deference. Her voice had dropped an octave since morning, had become the voice of someone who no longer needed to be smaller than the room. "Just doing my job, sir. Same way I did in Ramadi. Same way I'll do tomorrow." The general gestured to the wall. There was a shadow box mounted where a typical patient might hang a family photo. Instead, inside the glass were her combat boots, the leather worn soft as suede from 4 years of walking through ICU corridors, the laces still stained with dust that had come from Iraqi mountains, the tread worn down to near smooth from running toward casualties and away from explosions. Beneath the boots, on heavy stock paper with the official general's seal, was a handwritten note in the general's unmistakable script: "Some warriors never stop serving, they just change uniforms." Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the hint of something that might have been approval visible in the set of his jaw. Behind him, Breaker waited with the kind of patience that comes from knowing the operation was complete. The hard drive was secure. The fraud was exposed. The credibility was restored. The warrior was free to serve. "CEO wants to see you tomorrow," Webb said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional support. "Position in emergency trauma. Teaching combat medicine to civilians. We could use someone who knows what real pressure looks like." He paused. "Someone who doesn't flinch when people die." Sarah touched the glass of the shadow box. Her reflection overlaid the boots, the woman in scrubs, the woman in uniform, the woman who had been both and neither and finally just herself. Through the window, Denver's light spread out across the valley like a map of a city, learning that heroes didn't always announce themselves, that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it together, that the woman pushing a mop at midnight might be someone who'd already survived the worst and decided to survive it again, just wearing different clothes. The general's voice came soft. "You can stop hiding now." She nodded once, crisp and certain, the gesture of a senior chief petty officer who'd just been given permission to be exactly what she'd always been. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you liked this story of a hidden hero finally being seen, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next installment. And comment below, have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were? What happened when they found out?